Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Cantench, and I'm the Executive Director at the ACOS Alliance. Today's webinar is moderated by David Roth, Executive Editor for News at the New Yorker and ACOS Alliance co-founder. Perfect. Let's get started.
Welcome, everyone. I'm thrilled and honored and lucky to be moderating this panel this morning. I first of all want to thank the groups that have helped ACOS so consistently over so many years and that make this amazing movement possible. I've been lucky enough to be part of it from the beginning. I'm an editor at the New Yorker, and part of the panel discussion today, Navigating the New Safety Landscape, is to talk about how freelancers and news organizations can work together more effectively and come up with pragmatic solutions. I'm thrilled by the turnout. And again, I want to thank various organizations that have helped ACOS, from the beginning. The Overseas Press Club Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Logan Foundation, and the Open Society Foundations. They make this possible. But the energy of this is all of you who are joining us, particularly the freelancers. We're going to focus on sort of three main areas. I'm going to introduce our panelists and stop talking. And first, I'm going to ask them a series of questions about this last year. Again, navigating the new safety landscape. I first will ask each of them about their experiences in 2020, how they navigated this horrific year for so many people across the globe. Their responses to them, the kind of solutions, the methods they came up with to work as freelancers and as editors this year. And then at the end, recommendations. There'll be questions and answers from all of you. And then we're gonna, in the very last session, talk about recommendations. And we're gonna use the Mentimeter to get your thoughts on what sort of priorities are vital for this year and what kind of solutions that you've heard today sound valuable, so we can sort of have a consensus. So again, 4 sections: experiences of 2020 by the panelists, responses to 2020 by the panelists, a Q&A section, and then a last sort of joint session using the Mentimeter to come up with recommendations for 2021, another challenging year. We have an extraordinary panel. I'm going to do quick 1-sentence introductions to each of them. They deserve many minutes of descriptions of their own, but I want to let them talk here and let them talk about their careers and experiences over the years. Guillermo Galdas is a freelance journalist and filmmaker based in Lima, Peru. 3 times he's been awarded the International Journalist of the Year awards by One World Media. Mike Schoon is an independent filmmaker and journalist. He's the writer and director of the Frontline PBS collaboration, which we'll talk about today, American Voices, A Nation in Turmoil, and that has involved a tremendous amount of work in this last year. Vanessa Charlot is a Haitian-American photojournalist and a documentary photographer. She works in Miami Florida and St. Louis, Missouri. She attended college in Florida, and she'll tell you more about her own experiences as a journalist and her own experiences in life. And lastly, Beth Flynn is the deputy photo editor at the New York Times, where she has overseen their coverage across, primarily inside the United States, COVID, the racial justice demonstrations, and she also works for the investigative team there. I'm going to start out with Mike, and so they'll each answer questions of mine. They're going to have at times show photographs that they've taken and videos that they've worked on. This will be rough at times. I hope you'll, in the Zoom era, be patient with me if I'm shuffling papers and looking around. But I just want us to listen to them first, and then I'll listen to each other. So, Mike, can you kind of talk about how this project came together, American Voices, or sort of, I think we were all shocked. I was shocked, last February, March. A pandemic unfolds. How do you cover that safely and effectively at the same time?
I think, like everyone, and I think you said that best, I think back in February and March, we didn't know what was going to happen, collectively speaking. And so with that, I did feel an interest and curiosity to figure out, well, how does one cover this period of time? And similarly, my colleague and actually friend from my college days, who's currently an emergency medicine physician, he and I put our heads together, and that's sort of where we started in terms of, well, if we're going to cover this period of time, knowing fully well there's a pandemic, knowing fully well that there's a lot of safety issues at play, he and I decided, well, let's start doing, story coverage in different parts of the country, prospectively, understanding that we don't know what's ahead of us, but knowing that required a number of conversations, safety-wise, between him and me, basically putting our heads together from both our sort of pillars of experience. And then it's what actually led to a very recent publication, as you noted, with PBS Frontline, called American Voices. I believe we have an excerpt that we can show here.
Effort to keep Chicagoans safe during the COVID-19 pandemic.
In early April is when I started feeling lightheaded, dizzy. I was coughing. I lost my sense of taste and smell. Because I have an underlying condition, I thought my symptoms were related to that.
You're wearing your mask wrong. You have to cover your nose.
My name is Maya Ramirez. I'm 28 years old. One day I woke up. I was so weak, I just fell over. Everything was like dark, and I remember calling out for my boyfriend. I was like, George, and he would run and help me. And I was like, okay, I really need to go to the emergency room. So they immediately put me in a room, didn't even ask me my name or anything. I remember a doctor came in and told me, we're pretty sure we're gonna have to intubate you. Do you have someone that can make medical decisions for you? Then it's just kind of a blur what happened after I got intubated.
The day they told us that Myra, it was her last day, we're all in the trampoline. My mom was crying. My sisters, all my aunts were there. They were crying. They didn't know what to do. And we were just planning to go pick up a corpse. I was trying to avoid it. I love you so much. Uh-oh.
So Myra's story was one of many stories we were covering during the pandemic. And I think if I were to sort of wrap up from the beginning, what's been a guiding principle, or at least practice through this period, is a lot of research and a lot of conversation, constantly learning about things, as things were unfolding, and we were all learning things almost simultaneously.
How did you, just one quick follow-up, in terms of safety in the field and people contracting COVID? I mean, how did you work with the people on the project?
We had a, I guess, strange advantage in that we had seen, like my colleague, Dr. Blair Woodbury and I, we had seen Italy and China sort of confront this head on. So we had a head start in terms of the research and the practices that were going on, not to mention Dr. Woodbury's time in his emergency medical department. We were combining sort of a number of efforts in how his hospital was keeping safe, how I believe we were looking at research from BBC journalists in Wuhan, and how they were staying safe, covering out there. So we combined a number of strategies, and essentially because we were interested in seeing how the different parts of the country were sort of contending with this virus, and the lockdown specifically in March in the US, I recruited a number of cinematographers who were interested in working with us. And with that, there were sort of two parts to think about. The first one was a lot of screening. There were many very talented cinematographers who knew what they were doing, had a lot of talent, but if they at any point gave us pause towards risk, whether that's underlying conditions or they were in close proximity with someone with underlying conditions or with an age gap that was susceptible, it would be a red line. We would say, no, like it's best that you don't collaborate with us. We had a lot of boundaries that we were playing with, and we had a protocol that we felt comfortable with. So when we were working with a number of cinematographers, I think at that time in March and April, we were working with about 10 cinematographers. I was the one who would go out first, sort of testing the protocols that we were playing out. I would have a face shield and mask, and I would be disinfecting. There are things that I was doing that my colleague, my friend, Dr. Woodbury, wasn't aware of, and so we'd have to communicate and say, "Hey, I have to do an interview," and he would say, "It's best to do it outdoors." So there were just several things that we would just sort of go back and forth with in terms of what makes most sense. And it took a lot of conversations with each cinematographer in each place about what they felt comfortable with, as well as what I felt comfortable with. So we had several layers of just discussion, a lot of conversation, and a little bit of trial and error, but mostly we were pretty hypersensitive about safety from the get-go. And it took, with more research, scaling back how intense we had to be.
It's great. Thank you, Mike. Vanessa, you're operating alone as a photographer. The pandemic starts. And I'm going to be tough on myself, the New Yorker, as an editor there, and Beth about editors' roles, but we should have an honest conversation here. I mean, how did you navigate safety in terms of covering the pandemic? And did you feel like you got, good guidance and support from the editors you worked with?
Well, I covered the pandemic and everything that was transpiring in St. Louis, and specifically in North St. Louis. And if you know anything about North St. Louis is predominantly Black. It's a poor, working class neighborhood that lacks a lot of resources. So in terms of editors and going out for assignments, I actually had to provide PPE on my own. There were no real safety protocols or guidelines that was given to me. And so I had to take a lot of precautionary measures in order to ensure that I was safe, but also the people that I interacted was safe as well. So that was a bit, I guess, troublesome, but at the same time,
You're being diplomatic.
I am. But at the same time, I knew that documenting what was happening in North St. Louis was so important, because oftentimes Black stories are not told in its fullness. and you're not really exposed to the nuances and the complexities of Black life during a pandemic. And so I knew that it was pertinent to capture this.
And how were editors, during that period?
Do you want me to be frank, Dave?
Well, the success of this alliance, I think, is frankness, and as Mike said, lots of communication. But yeah, sure.
Right. So, if I got a phone call from an editor, it always went pretty much the same way. Oh my God, I love your work, and I say thank you, and then and then it's like, hey, there's this story, or there's something happening. Can you cover this? And I would just say sure, but I also came to not expect any kind of conversations around safety. And so I sought out my own colleagues that were in the field and asked them for different things that I can do. The other thing, though, is that when you're photographing in a community like St. Louis, specifically North St. Louis, resources are slim anyway, right? And so all you have is a mask. You may luck up and have a mask and gloves or a face shield, but there isn't a huge plethora of things that you can pull from in order to keep yourself safe. So not only me as the photojournalist, the PPE for me was slim, but even the members of the community, you notice that they didn't have an adequate amount of equipment to keep themselves safe as well.
Great. Guillermo, we're very intent on trying to make this an international conversation. And so how did you, cover the pandemic? Just, I guess, first safety wise, like staying healthy and also your colleagues.
Well, when the pandemic hit Peru in March, we knew that it was going to be chaos. I mean, we knew that we only had 500 intensive care beds for a country of 32 million people. We knew that hospitals had been abandoned for years and healthcare and all that. So we knew that it was not looking good. In terms of safety, again, like Mike mentioned, I called, friends that had been in Wuhan, friends that were in hospitals in northern Italy, that were in hospitals filming in the UK. And, we gathered some information. Actually, we wrote down a protocol to work. And I've been working with security and journalism for a long time. I've got, plenty of wars and heavy situations, but this was different. This is not a guerrilla movement or some drug traffickers. You cannot see the virus. You cannot identify the virus. And that made things, a little bit more challenging for sure. But we had covered a pandemic in the past. We had some experience. I filmed a 1-hour documentary about H1N1 in Mexico. We went to the place where it started. We knew roughly how viruses behave, and we are not doctors, but we knew that security was incredibly important. So we spent quite a lot of money on security equipment that we had to charge to the broadcaster afterwards. But it was like buying a bulletproof jacket. I mean, we didn't hesitate. We bought the best masks available at the moment that were incredibly expensive. We bought the best suits and everything. And then when I was filming with the Venezuelan guys that were picking up bodies in Lima, I was consulting with other friends, doctors, epidemiologists about the masks that they were using. And they all kept saying to me, they are not the right masks, tell them, and at the end, what happened is I tested positive for coronavirus. And I was the only one in my team that actually tested positive. Luckily enough, I didn't have any symptoms. I just isolated myself in the back of my house and operated there for 14 days as the best I could.
That's amazing. I want to go to Beth now, but I want to come back to how everybody cope with this personally. So Beth, and I was just going to say the big bad New York Times. I worked at the New York Times for 15 years, and now I'm at the New Yorker. So I am the mainstream media, in good ways and in bad. So, and I'll just again be blunt, but in terms of Beth working with freelancers, I mean, did you have, safety protocols you sent them? Was there PPE? Did you have like requirements of what you wanted people to do if they were going to shoot for the Times?
Yeah, we had all of that. I mean, look, we're extremely fortunate that we have the resources, the financial resources. We have a security team who puts together, any kind of security protocol for us, right? So we had a couple of videos that showed people who were working in super high risk situations like this, like Victor, where you're, on a COVID ward, to show how in the early parts of February, March, when nobody knew how it reacted, right? Like, was it on surfaces and all of that, that you could show you how to put on and take off your PPE so that you weren't touching anything. And in general, how to wear a mask if you had a beard, how to, all of that. And we supplied it. That was very tricky at the beginning because, as you know, there wasn't enough out there, and we wanted to be very cognizant of not taking PPE from hospitals and places, nursing homes, and that sort of thing that desperately needed it. So I think early on in the US, we relied first on freelance photographers who we had worked with for a long time in conflict situations, who had their own gear to some degree, while we built up a supply that we could distribute. And then we just started distributing to people who we put on assignment. We had a level of protocol in terms of distance. If you went to do a portrait of someone, you had to be at least 6 feet away. You had to be outside. In fact, we had one situation where we had sent someone, it's not this picture, but we had sent someone to a funeral home, an overwhelmed funeral home, and the guy, we said, outside only, in front of the place, to protect the photographer, but also to protect the person we're photographing, because nobody really knows in any given moment if they are infected, right? So we had said outside. The funeral director said, come in, we're all masked, we're safe, it's clean. And he went in and the photographer made pictures inside, and we did not publish those because it was sort of exactly what we asked them not to do, even though they were better pictures. So there were consequences on that level too. If we went inside, we had a staff photographer in late spring, when we were doing the non-COVID stories about sort of semi-tangentially COVID, an athlete, how are professional athletes or Olympic athletes preparing during this time or keeping up. And we made sure ahead of time that the photographer and the athlete and the rehab counselor were the only ones in this huge place, and we would only go in for 15 minutes, all of that. So there was a lot of preparation before somebody went anywhere. Doug Mills, traveling with the president, takes a COVID test every single day. This is the famous Tulsa rally, which was in June, I think, late June. A lot of people unmasked. Doug and whoever was traveling with him always had KN95s on and gloves and the whole thing. But those aren't foolproof. But yeah, we always supplied for our freelancers. And we also had in place if you had symptoms after being on assignment for us, we had a 14-day paid window in which we would pay someone to quarantine so that they weren't losing work day rates.
That's great. I want to shift to the second round of questions, and this is more about responding to this. And I want to ask personally how you took care of yourselves also. I want to talk about the protests that then emerged later in the spring. But, for each of the photographers and videographers, sort of how you, helped yourself psychologically in dealing with this. And then I'll ask Beth the same question about helping the people that were working for her. So Mike, if you can talk a bit about the protest briefly, but then just in general, how you're dealing with the mental strain over the course of the first at least half of the year.
To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure I have a good balance quite yet in terms of how to manage my psychological stress. It's tricky just because, especially with the intensity of the project that we've been running, my I usually just lean on just working more. I admit. I mean, just if I to be perfectly honest, and I think that I've started to think about strategies in terms of taking breaks here and there, but for the most part, there hasn't been a good process. Partially because this year is just rife with so many events popping up over and over again, and I think they're in light of compulsion to be close to that or figure out how to cover that. I think it was, to mention the protest, I think that was a pretty surprising and mentally taxing period because I'm based in St. Paul, Minnesota, and so which is of the Twin Cities. So I was only 20 minutes away from the place where George Floyd was unfortunately killed, and so with that, while making this documentary about how this country was handling COVID-19, it was clear to me and my colleagues, but very clear to me when I heard of his death and people gathering to protest, there was no doubt I had to get out there and film this. And then I don't believe I stopped filming for 2 weeks. I mean, it was about 2 weeks straight. So I think it was a combination of knowing that there's something to cover, knowing that I had to cover it, but then constantly checking myself in terms of what it meant to do so safely. But again, coming back to that, the psychological aspect was not something that is at the forefront of my mind. It was more just, how do I get these images and what does it take? Now, if there's a built-in strategy is similar to what I was saying before. I have necessary check-ins and conversations I have with my colleagues, Dr. Woodbury, as well as a lot of the other cinematographers. Many of them, as much as they are colleagues, they're very good friends. And I definitely call Derek Knowles or Emily Thomas or Arthur Nazarian, just these cinematographers across the country. And they say, hey, what's up? What am I filming? I'm like, hey, I just kind of want to talk. How you doing? You okay? I'm okay. Okay, good, great. As much as I'm asking them, hey, what are you interested in covering? It can be sometimes where I'm like, I'm just on my way to this place. I'd love to just debrief with you. And I think, thankfully, because we were by then I think we were running around 14 or 15 cinematographers. We all sort of had this sort of solidarity of just checking each other out because we knew that we were all going out there solo, and so. Just comes back to those conversations and how I think in retrospect now, I can very much say that those conversations were vital to my psychological well-being.
Great, thanks, Mike. Vanessa, and we've all talked before this panel. You're covering the protests in St. Louis. You've said this to us earlier before that we started this, but you find yourself singled out by police for harassment as a Black photographer than as a white photographer. Right. You're a veteran, and you talk about how that helped you in a certain way, how you would identify yourself as a veteran. So again, in blunt and honest terms, how did you cover the protests, and then how psychologically the toll of that harassment on you, and again, are you getting you're working alone? Are you getting support from your editors and your organizations as a freelancer?
Okay, let me try to address your three-part question.
Sorry.
So no, it's fine. How am I covering the protest? Just to paint a picture, St. Louis exists in the backdrop of the Ferguson uprising, right? With the death or the killing of Mike Brown. So the tension, racial tension, tension between police and communities, that exists every single day, right? So there's nothing particularly new about that. And so when the protest began here in St. Louis, it was May 29th. And I literally heard people outside of my window in the streets. And I grabbed my camera and I immediately took to the streets. What has been deeply troubling about this is that I cannot separate myself from the people in the streets, right? I look like them. They could be my mother, my friend, my brother, my son. So there is automatically a very deep connection there. I just so happen to not be the Black mother that is crying for their child that day. And so there's a deep connection that I feel. There is also this continuance that is created between myself, my camera, and the subjects, right? Like it just all blends into one thing emotionally, because they are an extension of me. And so psychologically, similar to Mike, it was hard for me to detach. I was literally in the streets every day for 2 to 3 months, every single day, nonstop, because I understand that history is often told from the position of the victor and not the victim, right? And so like, I did not want to have images or create images that showed just Black people being upset without addressing why are they upset? Why are people in the streets? I have an image of a Black woman that's sitting on the hood of a car and she has an upside down flag. And the reason why that image spoke so strongly to me and just a lot of other people is, it forces you to ask the question, what would make a mother leave her home in the middle of a global pandemic and hit the streets? What exactly is happening here? And quite honestly, it's because she is dealing with two existential threats to her life, right? On one end, she has police officers, and then on the other end, she has coronavirus. And so the reality is there is no picking and choosing for a lot of communities of color. You have to fight both simultaneously. So because I was in the streets like that, personally, it took a toll in the sense that I began to find myself more withdrawn, not really wanting to engage with my friends that way. I was able to get a grant from IWMF that provided me with the resources to get professional help in terms of a therapist and different things like that. But I think that something that is important to remember is that it is not just a news story, right? Like it's not just beautiful photographs that I'm always grateful when people are like, oh my God, I saw your work in Oprah. This is fantastic. Great. But this is my life, and at any moment I have a son. So I'm very scared about what can that look like for him. Right now he's 5, but what about 10 years from now, right? Will this cute little kid be now considered as something that is a threat? And so being singled out from police officers was difficult because here in St. Louis, the relationship is tense. I'm sure they don't want to be presented in a certain light, but I was also there literally standing there when a police officer shot an activist named Mike Avery. I was standing literally right there, right? And so realizing that my saving grace as a veteran was I always wore my veteran's hat because I knew that this would be a something of demarcation that makes me feel or makes me appear less of a threat, right? Like, okay, you're one of us. But the reality is, as someone that proudly served in the military, when I take off that uniform, you don't see me as a soldier anymore. You see me as a Black woman. And so, I had to navigate through that.
And I'm just in that moment, the shooting happens, or you have a police officer harassing you.
Yeah.
What do you say? How do you, it's ridiculous you're in that position, but how do you de-escalate that moment? Are you silent? Do you speak to them more? Do you lower your camera?
I honestly, I speak to them. I don't come off really aggressive. I'm actually very calm, even though on the inside I'm seething, right? You know, I ask them, like, how are you doing? What's going on? Like, I try to personalize myself and humanize myself in front of them in a way that neutralizes the situation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If I see that, you know, that cop is committed to being aggressive, I just try to remove myself from the situation. But again, here in St. Louis, because of the racial tension, police officers are not really viewed as, or some, I'm not going to say all, but some, in some cases, when you have groups like the Proud Boys, when you have other citizens that are in, you know, I remember one time there was a white male in a huge pickup truck, and I was trying to capture a photograph of a group of protesters in front of the Florissant Police Department, and he was trying to drive into the crowd. And I'm standing right there and I'm trying to say, hey, just, you know, relax, you know, whatever. And he was not really hearing that. But moreover, I tried to get the attention of the police officer, and the police officer didn't engage, even though the truck was coming in, right? So sometimes you have police officers that you can reason with, and sometimes you don't. And you have to choose your battles wisely, even though it's a very emotional time.
That's great and very true. Guillermo, you've dealt with law enforcement, you know, in different situations in Latin America. You've dealt with, you know, you've covered narco traffickers. You've dealt with detention. And so I want to ask you the same questions about how the solutions you kind of came up with when you covered dangerous situations, protests, and other things. And then, you know, there's less attention, particularly there was in the Trump era, to international stories. And, you know, I would assume you felt kind of less support and less attention to abuses of journalists in Peru and other parts of Latin America. How do you cope with that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, to begin with, I have at least 4 friends that have been killed in Mexico in the last decade. People that have worked with me directly, people that, I don't know, that were doing their job every day. And it was, you know, you always, one of them particularly, I never thought he could be killed, but they killed him. And yes, as you said, I've been detained, I've been shot at, I've been everything. And I think that respect for journalism in this part of the world is not the right word. You know, it's always trying to convince people that you are doing your job, that, you know, I mean, recently with the police covering some protests in Peru when they ousted the president, I mean, the police shot at us directly. We have a shot of, you know, these there were rubber bullets, but, you know, he shot to us and we were within 4 meters, you know, and a couple of my friends got hit in the back, in the hand. And you can imagine what will happen if you arrive to a checkpoint in Colombia where you have a 16-year-old with an AK-47 without covering his face, and he tells you that you are not going through, for example. And the same, you know, with, and in Mexico, the problem that we've had is that we don't know who's who anymore. You know, I think I'm equally nervous if the police stops me, or if an armed group with no signs stop me. I mean, it will be the same procedure. And I think that, yes, having said that thing about my friends, you know, I've got in Colombia 3 friends that have to hang around with bodyguards. In Peru, they've murdered a journalist not long ago, but also it's difficult to tell stories. Again, people don't want you there. They believe the press exacerbates the situation, etc. So I don't think it's got easier. I think it's got more difficult, more even in a COVID pandemic, world. But I think Latin America is the place in the world where more journalists get killed. And from my 4 friends in Mexico that were killed, nobody has been jailed for the murder. So that tells you a lot about the situation as well. So I think it's been more difficult. And the thing is, I think what we rely on nowadays a lot is that thanks to technology, practically anybody can film. So when I arrived, for example, with the protests, we had quite a lot of people coming to us because they knew that we were filming, that we were journalists, with pictures from their mobile phones where you could see the police firing at us. So that, and when you arrive to a village in the middle of Mexico, and there's been an execution, and obviously you arrive, you try to cover the situation, but then you will have people that approach you and say, hey, I have this video, so you rely, I think, a lot on that technology, on the fact that everybody has a phone and films and whatever to piece together what really happened.
And just again, Guillermo, that when you were detained, how do you act in that moment? How do you, same thing about de-escalating, and then so when you're in detention, how do you get through that period psychologically?
I've been detained twice, and actually once I was detained by the Navy in Colombia, and they forced me to board a ship in the middle of a river, in the middle of a conflict zone. And I was telling to them that I didn't want to go on board because if I was on board, that would make me a target as well. And at the end, they said to me, you are under arrest, come on board. They took away my sat phone. They took away my camera. They checked everything. They wanted to fly me over to an American military base in the middle of nowhere. And I refused. And I tell you something, I have a friend that was with me. And at that time, he was a target of the paramilitaries, a target of several armed groups. And I was worried because at one point I thought if we board that helicopter, they can push us over. And this is not Hollywood. This is the reality of Latin America. And another time I was detained by an illegal group, by an armed group. I was also detained by force because I said to them, listen, I want to leave. And they said, no, you are staying here with us until we say. And I think the trick is to be calm. It's not easy. It's not, and it's like, of course, I'm Latino, I have fire inside. I want to tell them, listen, what the hell, I'm doing my job and everything. So all the time, I'm thinking, to be honest, my trick is I'm thinking that I'm in the sea surfing. I'm thinking about my board, the waves, things that can calm me down, so I can be calm. And I think the trick is to be calm, to show them that you are in charge of yourself and that you are secure of what you're saying and how important is the work that you are doing. Not only because you're exposing them, because you are also ultimately giving them also a voice if they have anything to say.
That's terrific. And I'm gonna ask Beth a question now, but then we're gonna go to the Q&A in about 5 minutes once Beth finishes. And there's 5 questions now in the Q&A queue, so please, people, start adding to those 5. I guess, Beth, everyone's talking very personally here, which I think is really valuable because we're all not alone. But there's I always, in my past work in the field, it helped tremendously to talk to colleagues about how I was feeling, what I was going through. So, I guess did you see patterns of problems people were having psychologically as they, work through the course of the year? And then what kind of support did the Times offer them? Did you sort of have people stop shooting for a while, or, I'm throwing out things here, but I'm just wondering.
No, I mean, I don't recall anybody stop shooting. We always had conversations with people if they were comfortable or not, right? And to make it very clear that like turning down the assignment plays no part in us calling you next week or tomorrow or whatever. I mean, it's certainly not for everyone. We had our own staffers who were, immunocompromised or in the dangerous category of ages where we just took them off the streets and gave them roles as editors or other things to keep them safe as well. So it was never, I mean, no one would ever have forced anyone to take any of these jobs, right? And on top of that, we had long conversations with people, especially during the protests or especially going into high risk situations like hospitals with our security team to make sure that they understood both the risks that they were taking, but also the things they could do to mitigate the risks, right? Like here's, if you're having to get in a car with someone to get out of a dangerous area, like roll the windows down and, just sort of everything you weren't thinking of to prepare, or possibly not thinking of to keep yourself safe during the assignment. But I can't recall anybody who wanted out ever. It was, I think, and maybe some of that is a little worrisome too, that people were taking jobs that they weren't comfortable taking because the economy was tanking too, I think, for freelancers. Like, we were certainly cutting back out of just danger or, on what we were assigning, especially when everyone, like, as I think someone said, no one had any idea what the virus was doing, right? So we had people send us selfies, which we never would have done in the past, or we had like Annie Tritt did a series of Zoom portraits really early on because we didn't want to send people close to other people or put people, either the subject, or this is one of Annie's, where she would like say to people like, show me your house. And so she would sort of set it up like, oh, okay, that's great by the window. And hey, like those, like sit over there and sort of direct it from afar and then photograph it via Zoom. There was a lot of ways people got really creative in covering non-COVID assignments. We still had an art section to put out. We still had a food section to put out. So they got creative on how to do that and how to do that safely, both for the person people we were photographing and the photographer themselves. But we just made sure everybody had the right gear and was the assignment worth doing, right? Like we said no to a lot of things, like, no, that's too high risk, or, that picture isn't worth possibly infecting the photographer or the person we're photographing, or, we did a lot of outside portraits early on and from distances. We didn't fly people for a really long time either, staff or freelancers, until we were more certain about what the risks were doing that.
And one takeaway here is that saying no, and again, I'm maybe an evil editor, saying no as a freelancer to an assignment and as an editor to an assignment, like thinking through, is this really going to produce that remarkable, a story? And I think that's important on both sides, because it is such a Darwinian moment. Well, in general, in journalism and this year, but people are going to take risks because that can advance you professionally, but sometimes the risks aren't worth it. I'm going to go through the questions I have.
I think,
go ahead. Yes.
We may get to this a little bit later in the panel, but I also think it's really important to put the onus back on the news organization you're working for, right? Like say, hey, great, I'm happy to do this, but I need to go buy PPE, or I need to rent a car because it's not so safe to be in, Ubers or public transportation or things like that. And just force them to say no to you, right? Or hopefully say yes to you. But put all that in front of them. I mean, you need to be safe doing your job for yourself, for future work, for the people that you're going to photograph. And you should be putting those difficult questions in front of them. I mean, the biggest places have the money to, at least, they may not be able to get the gear to you, but they should reimburse you for the gear you're using, the masks and the gloves and all of that. Stuff is not expensive. I mean, it was in March, obviously, but it's not now. Anyway.
Great. No, that's, we'll come back to that in the recommendations section. And I can say and I'm commissioning print pieces or text pieces at the New Yorker, I like it. And again, you guys are going to shake your heads, but when a freelancer asks me that kind of question, that they're thinking about the consequences of things going wrong, that's good. Because often there are people I've never even met, and I'm just sort of in an email exchange with them. So let me get into these questions from folks. We now have 10 of them. Panelists, I'm going to kind of farm them out. I'm going to choose each of you to answer one, and just so we can move through these. And I'm just, for the participants, I'm just going through these in order that they landed here in the Q&A box. The first question is from Aliyah Bashir, and I'm going to sort of go to you, Mike. You've had a break for a bit here. How do you make your sources feel comfortable in a fearful environment? And I guess I'm thinking of like, COVID patients, some of whom are, in a hospital and maybe not, fully aware of even what's going on around them. So how do you deal with those sort of ethical issues?
I think the start is we haven't filmed anyone directly into a hospital at this time. At least my team hasn't. Usually we work through the comms departments at these hospitals to gauge that sort of comfort level first. Beyond that though, I mean, Myra is a good example where it really does take a degree of sort of clarity and conversation towards, well, this is what we're trying to do. This is our plan. Do you feel comfortable? And then just making sure everyone is on the same page. I think probably I had done more of sort of a transparent approach with these characters, saying, well, I'd like to do this. What do you think? And then they'd say, no, I don't know. I'd probably step in like, that's fine. Totally fine. I mean, I'd try to make sure, I think everyone, because we are doing this longitudinally, our characters, we had been developing relationships over this past several months. So we sort of knew where their thresholds were, but also understood that it could change at any point. And so it was more of an adaptive strategy with each person, and really understanding, not only the risk that obviously like we were undergoing, but the risk we were putting them in, as we could have been asymptomatic carriers of said virus. And so we made sure, because we were so strict in our protocols, I felt comfortable, and I believe our cinematographers felt comfortable as the comfort level of our sources and their safety was of primary concern to us. And then from there, it became our safety as an issue, and then beyond. So
that's great. Beth, this is coming to you. It's from, and I apologize to the questioners if I mess up somebody's name, Giovanni Uleri. It's about risk assessment forms, that they're pretty commonplace in the UK. Giovanni, he's, the BBC where he's worked has protocols, and he found that very helpful to freelancers. So are there risk assessments for every single, photographer that must submit one to you?
Yeah, early on, I mean, last spring, every assignment we did, we checked in with our security team and the photographer who was going, or I shouldn't say every, but everyone that we had every new situation, right? Or every change of the virus. We checked in with our security team, and the photographer was on that call to talk about, we're going into a rehab center, or, this is whatever. Some of the situations I've already spoken about. We have the photo editors all have an understanding of what they should be asking photographers, like especially someone who they haven't possibly worked with yet, like, what do you have for PPE gear? And if there's a window of time, we ship them a kit. We try to work enough in advance so that, we can FedEx it within and have it there within a day or two, which would be gloves, and depending on the level of risk, it's gloves and a mask and maybe a gown or a suit, depending. Or we say, do you have your own? And then we ask them to put it on the expenses so that they can replace it. But yeah, absolutely.
And you had phone calls before?
Yeah, we had like Zooms or Google Hangouts or something. So, or via phone, whatever, where our security folks who were, whose job it is to understand how our work is changing as the virus changes, and sort of saying like, what, let's not do that assignment, or yeah, we can do that, but here's what I want you to do. I don't want you to stay for more than 10 minutes inside and go outside, or ask them, if you're going into someone's home and you're going to be there, you have to be there for more than 10 minutes, ask them to open the windows, just information that could give them, a better level of the risk they're taking.
And again, for everybody that's watching, and I know it takes courage to ask these questions of editors. I hear other news organizations have phone calls or Zoom calls before assignments. Can we have one of those? Again, but that might be unrealistic, but let's, aim high here. And a question from an anonymous attendee for Vanessa. Which media outlets did you freelance for? And then after the kind of protests and maybe the immediate, push for photographs has died down, did they pick you up for subsequent assignments?
Let's see, I freelanced for the New Yorker. I've been commissioned. No, that was awesome.
Oh, good. Thank God.
Oh yeah, that was awesome. I actually did the story for Leslie McSpadden, which is the mother of Mike Brown, for the New Yorker. So that was great. I've been commissioned by O Magazine for the Breonna Taylor edition. Let's see, I've done Vogue UK, The Guardian. I was actually there to cover the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa riot, or the Tulsa massacre. But at that same time, that's when the Trump rally was happening. So that was extremely intense because they were less than a mile away from each other. So I was at Black Wall Street, and then I would go to the rally. I didn't go in, but I have a lot of pictures from the outside. Let's see. There's been a few. It escapes me now, but there have been a few.
And did those relationships, have they continued? With further assignments? Yeah.
So some of them have. I've done 2 or 3 for the New Yorker. So the relationship that I've built with I believe her name is Stacy Pittman, has been really cool. She's awesome.
And I did not put Vanessa up to this, and I haven't worked with Vanessa. I'm like a dweeb text guy. The photo department is totally.
I was going to say, David, geez.
Totally separate. There was genuine anxiety on my face when you mentioned it. So, anyway, then I just want to move on to the next question, Vanessa. Okay. This is about, I'm trying to figure out who this is about. Access to hospitals in the UK in February, March, and April was denied to a lot of journalists. The question's from Pete Alozzi. So photographing the pandemic on ground zero was impossible. How did the panelists get access to hospitals and morgues? And did they find getting permission difficult? And Guillermo, I'm gonna ask you, because there's kind of an ethics thing too. You're going in like the houses of people who've died. Yeah. So I guess getting into hospitals, but also, getting into people's homes in these situations.
I think like many things in journalism, access is very important. So at the beginning of the pandemic, I went and spoke with the director of the biggest hospital in Peru. They had 30 intensive care beds, and we knew that quite a lot of the action or the sick people were going to end up there. So we spoke with them, we showed them a number of things that we had done in the past, and we ended up convincing him that it was important to show what was going to happen. And at the end, he agreed. And what we didn't do is, I mean, we saw a lot of people dying inside intensive care in one. And this is the thing with the shifts and the PPE and that. 3 days ago, we were actually putting the numbers down on how much money we spent on PPE for the team. We spent more than $8,000, you know, and it was because when you film inside intensive care, you might have a scene that was 40 minutes, and the character that we were following, that was the head of all the intensive care, she will go out. So you need to take out your suit, you need to change your mask, and you will go to the cafeteria to do something else, and then you will go in again, and then you will go into another COVID area. So it was dressing and undressing all day long. But with the families, with the people that we saw dying, we never did anything about them, about those. We thought, I personally thought it was pornographic, you know, to show that level of misery and that level of pain of not being able for the relatives to say goodbye to the brother, father, sister, whatever. So what we did is we followed a guy that we thought he was going to die, but he didn't. And he made it out. So that was a story that showed how bad things were inside, but it had a good ending. It was not as dramatic. And with the morgue and the crematorium, it was incredibly difficult. I went inside without a camera first. I spoke with everybody there, and I remember one of the guys that was working there, that was a Venezuelan. He was incredibly tall. He was like 6'3" or 4". He was massive. And I remember him, you know, looking at me like down, and he started crying. And you know, I just hold his hand and said like, hey man, you know, calm down. This is horrific. And he said, you know, I never thought I was going to see so much death in my life, blood, kids, I'm seeing everything. And at the end, I sat down with him, and the owner of the place came, and he realized, and I said, listen, I don't want to show that your oven is not working. I don't want to show that. I want to show the incredible work that you and your people are doing here, because if you were not doing this, you know, if nobody wanted to work with dead bodies infected with COVID, you know, these bodies will be at homes, will be on the streets, will be everywhere, if nobody was able and brave enough to pick them up. And I think that is important to show. If you notice, I mean, on the piece that we did for Channel 4 about the one that won the Rory Peck, we didn't show a lot of what we saw at the crematorium, you know, because it was, I mean, I always think about the effect that I'm going to cause with the pictures that I show. And I didn't think it was necessary to show so much, you know, death and misery. You know, with a couple of shots of the car boxes, you know, and all that, it was enough. And so, yes, I think it's about access, and it's about how the people that you are going to film you perceive you. And with the Venezuelans, again, picking up bodies, it was not us going, filming for a day and leaving. No, we went there for more than 2 weeks. We spent 2 weeks living with them, staying, you know, with them in their place, close to the crematorium, having lunch with them, having breakfast, you know, being with them when they were talking with their friends and families in Venezuela, telling them what they were doing. So, you know, they saw us as part of the team. And when we arrived at the houses where the dead people were lying inside, in some cases, they had been lying dead for more than 2-3 days. And they were in the middle of the living room in this, you know, tiny house on this shanty town on the outskirts of Lima. The smell was unbearable. you know, in more than a couple of situations, we arrive and the sons, the relatives, they were completely drunk, completely off their heads. A couple of times was even very dangerous for us because they were racist against the Venezuelans. You know, they were saying like, I can't believe that a Venezuelan is picking up the body of my father. And at one point I had to step in and said, hey man, do you want these guys to leave? Because you are being incredibly rude. I know you have a lot of pain, but I also cannot see that you've been drinking. And the guy asked me, who the hell are you? And I said, I'm a storyteller that is telling the story of these guys. I didn't give him, and then I calmed him down. Again, the trick of calming him down, I sat down with him and his brother. They offered me a drink. I said, hey man, I'm not going to take off my mask, you know, and I hold their hands, and it was like trying to put myself on their shoes. And then I also told them, listen, these guys are doing an incredible work because nobody wants to pick up these bodies. And if they don't do it, your father is going to lie here for days, you know, and it already smells really bad in here. And look at your kids and look at the health of your other relatives. So it was like that, but it was always asking permission, always trying to put yourself in the shoes of the other people, and always trying to show them as well that you are not there after the pornography. You know, you are there after the human stories, and there is a limit. There is a limit.
Yeah.
That's amazing, Guillermo. Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions. We're going to end around 11:20. We might then 11:15 was our original time, but I hope everyone's enjoying this. I am. This is for Beth. It's actually from Victor Blue, your own photographer, and he's well, you know, see, editors are human, everybody. And panelists, by the way, I'm going to take another couple questions, but then I want to, we're going to do the Mentimeter thing, but I also want to ask each of you to talk about like outlets that really treated you well, like concrete examples of it. And then if you want, you can name some that didn't treat you so well. But again, the point is like the Mentimeter and after we finish the Q&A will be to talk about like solutions and places that are functioning well and treating their people well. So Victor's question, Beth, is about this issue of the distancing that was created during the pandemic. You know, and so with the pandemic throwing everyone to the winds, Victor asks, was it tough to collaborate both with folks in the field as well as inside the paper? Or was it sort of seamless in terms of communicating virtually instead of being able to meet people face to face?
I mean, it wasn't, yeah, it was pretty seamless. I mean, weirdly, we've been practicing working remotely for like a year and a half or 2 years before the pandemic hit, because of maybe a cyber attack or another 9/11, certainly not nobody foresaw like that, oh, it would be a global pandemic. So we had like surprise, you get a phone call at 5:30 in the morning saying your department is remote today, after everybody had solid training in it. So that part was seamless. It's always better to see someone in person, and I try to do Google Hangouts more than, or Zooms or whatever, more than phone conversations, just because I like to see other humans. The hardest part, I think, is just getting a hold of people. Like, you know, everyone's got a lot going on. They have, you know, people they're taking care of. They have kids who are not in school. They have, you know, so I think that was the single most complicating thing, is that you couldn't just swing by somebody's desk in print, or, you know, an interactive designer or something and say, hey, I have this project we want to work on. You had to sort of like try to, you know, find a time to meet. With the photographers, I just always try to show them the edit before it gets published and say like, you know, and a couple of times when it's been an interactive, I've just made like a video on my phone and just run through the video on my screen, because it's all happening behind our, you know, our firewall. And then I send them the video and we talk about it, so that they can see how the work is being played. Or but I always try to ask people, like, are there any that you know, that are like your favorites that you really want to see published? And if I don't agree, we talk about why. You know, And often, frankly, we weren't doing that part of it in person anyway, because people are on assignment, traveling to other places. So that I haven't felt it to be a huge crimp, other than I just miss seeing people, just walking by someone's desk in a serendipitous conversation or something.
The theme here is over communicating.
Yes.
From editors to photographers, from photographers to police officers or drunk people in their households. So I want to, the Mentimeter is what I want to do next, and this is something that I think all the people in the audience have received. And Laura here is now taking over the screen, thank goodness, and she's going to show us how you can enter in. There's an instruction she's posting in the chat about head over now and answer the questions in the Mentimeter, and that will. We're basically looking for like keywords and issues that, according to the audience, what your own thoughts in the last year, what are the current threats faced by journalists, and those things. If everybody in the audience could answer those questions, and then with the panelists, I just want to, do one last quick round. I think some of you have had good experiences with certain outlets, and while folks fill out the Mentimeter, I'll start with Mike. One positive experience with an outlet, and what did they do right? If you feel comfortable talking about it.
Sure. I mean, not to sort of say the same things as everyone else. I think, at least when I talk to editors, so I worked with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and so those are two examples where they know me in the way that I ask a lot of questions, and I make sure to take the time, and they humor really all that time that I require before I go into an assignment or a period where I'm covering. So I think voicing out all these concerns, as well as figuring out how to do our jobs ethically and safely has really been the thing that I desire and need most in these situations. And also, in those conversations, I'm able to have similar conversations with my own team when we're I'm asking people to go out and filming in their respective areas. At the same time, and I have to credit Vanessa, I was also a recipient of an IWMF grant too. And so I think being a freelancer and just independent, you sort of have to just make lemonade. You just have to find resources from anywhere you can. We don't have a big organization backing us, and if we do, it's only for one assignment, not for this the course of this pandemic. So it's up to us. We have to do this on our own. And so each of these conversations are important, but it's the onus is on us in some sense. And we sort of feel, I don't know if this is the partially the psychological thing, but we're alone out here. But everyone is in their own sense. But then, especially for the freelancers and independents, we have to do this on our own. So.
That's great, Mike. And Vanessa, you mentioned IWMF. You're not allowed to mention the New Yorker again, but I guess a positive experience. And you can, the reason I know there's lots of, including the New Yorker, mishandles assignments. I'm not, trying to pretend that there isn't a problem with assignment editors not asking about safety, but I did want to, if they exist, talk about good experiences. And for the people watching, good organizations, news organizations, and then you mentioned IWMF as a source of support.
Yeah, no, IWMF is fantastic. In terms of helping me get trained up really well, Authority Collective was great. There was one other one that escapes me, but having a great experience, I would venture to say Oprah Magazine stands out to me.
Great.
And quite honestly, because the people that reached out to me really, first of all, they actually watched some of my interviews, right? So because of that, they really got to know my work and what I care about. And we had a lot of conversations. They allowed me to be authentically myself, unapologetically myself. They understood why I focused on Black life, why I aesthetically, gravitate towards Black and white photograph. Like they just got it. And so because of that, they really trusted me to produce a photograph that was a part of such an amazing issue that was really myself. Like they just gave me creative license, and they asked pertinent questions like, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Are you okay? Do you need anything? And so it transcended from something that was rather transactional to really, really caring about me as a person, and also me as a photographer, to ensure that whoever sees these photographs really get a good glimpse as to the kind of work that I produce.
That's great, and it's wonderful to hear, and hats off to Oprah. Guillermo, any good experiences, whether it's, again, a news organization helping you or some sort of foundation or support you received?
Well, I work a lot, as you know, for Channel 4, for Channel 4 News in particular. And I think that the relationship between the journalist and the editor is crucial. I trust my editors a lot, and I think that they trust me as well. And it's always, the question of what do you need to do what you are doing. They know that, some of the things that we've done, of course, that they were dangerous, and how we minimize, all danger. And the thing is that there is fluent communication. And I think the problem is when you don't have such backing. And I'm very lucky to have that backing from Channel 4, but I meet on the ground quite a lot of freelancers that they haven't got a fully commission, for example, and they're trying to get a story, so that story will get commission, and their backing is really poor, in the sense that they don't have anyone telling them, listen, what about this area? Have you done a risk assessment? Have you are in contact? Okay, we are going to maintain contact every 5 hours. If you don't call in 5 hours, what do we do? Who do we call first, etc. And I think that's incredibly important. And I find myself when I'm on the field, and I'm going to Colombia on Saturday, and I'm going to film something about child soldiers in an area which is really complex. I'm feeling, at the moment, a security assessment of what we're going to do, and I really like the feedback of chatting through, the different options and what do we do. And the most important thing is that there is nothing that is more important than your security. It doesn't matter if you're going to interview God, if they offer you an interview God, it's the most important thing is how you do it, how you get there, how you get out. And if you don't have that clear, it's can turn dangerous.
Thank you, Guillermo. That's a perfect note to end on. As you all saw on the screen there, law enforcement was a big concern. Disinformation is a big concern. Support. I have my own sort of notes here. Lots of communication. Talk to other journalists. Buy the best equipment. Check in with colleagues. When you're in a tense situation, personalize it. Be calm. Think of surfing, as Guillermo said. Again, hats off to Oprah Magazine, and I think trust. To have trust in each other, to ask kind of blunt questions. Beth, I'm not going to let you talk again because editor, but I think that, I just think that it's easy for us to say or nod. Beth, you can nod, but when when a freelancer asks a tough question about safety and how an assignment's going to go, that increases the editor's, I think, confidence in that freelancer. And I hope I'm right, Beth. Yeah. And it's dangerous. You're the freelancer. The editor has all the power, but over communicating and honesty builds these relationships of trust that help us all. And I'm signing off here. And just again, as Guillermo said, nothing is more important than your safety. And and that's important for news organizations too. It is, and personally, and then when tragedies happen, it hurts the freelancer most of all, but it also is an enormous trauma for the news organization too. And I think we've all learned that over the last year. So thank you all for joining, and all the panelists. And I hope we've come up with some solutions from 2020, some positive things from 2020 about navigating this amazingly challenging time. So thank you all for participating. Thank everyone for listening. And thank you most of all for ACOS.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Keep up
Ciao.
your amazing work.